Last but certainly not least, our final talk is from Dan Dorder.
Norder.
But yeah, computer hobbyist for more than 45 years. Started with roguelike games in 1987, playing one of the first versions of NetHack. And then, yeah, you got into desktop publishing and combined those skills and internet experience into your professional career. And currently working on a retro 8-bit pixel art roguelike game called Elflings. And yeah, here to celebrate the 60-year anniversary of Basic. It's so exciting.
All right. Hey, thanks for having me. Thank you all for staying up for this last presentation of the evening. This is all about Chase, which is the basic language proto-roguelike. Down at the bottom of the screen here, we have my Mastodon address, basically at Elflings. Elflings, of course, the game that was already mentioned. And what this presentation is going to be about basically is, what is this doing? There it is. Robots, robots, robots. All right, and we kind of already did an about me, so I don't really need to go over this, and I will use the time for the rest of the presentation. All right, so when I talk about a proto-roguelike, how is Chase like a primitive roguelike? Well, it is top-down, it's turn-based, and the glyphs here are a symbol of the location of items. It's not like a text description like you're in a wind of twisty passageways all like. It's actually showing you a map. And then the placement of objects are entirely random. And of course, there's permadeath. Now, over on the right, I have made a screen. The original, of course, would be all one color. Black on white for paper for the very first version. But I have colorized it to make it stand out a little bit more. You can see that the player is an asterisk, which is in green. The robots, which are the enemy, are in red, and they're the plus sign. And then the obstacles are X's. Okay, so we advance one. Your player moves one to the right, and then the robots just follow after you. One of the 5 robots has already crashed into an obstacle and died. The rest are just kind of chasing after you, which is where the name comes from. Chase, however, is not a real roguelike because it's extremely basic. This is just the player, the robots, and the walls. I've already explained to you the entire game. There's no inventory, skills, stats. You don't have multiple ways to do things, which is one of the coolest things of roguelikes. It's not even technically procedurally based because the randomness is just too random. There's no sense to any of it. It just kind of throws everything out there and it lands where it lands. And then most unusual of all for many of our ways of looking at games is there's no real combat, at least in the typical sense. Then we move again here. The player hops up behind an obstacle. 2 more robots crash into obstacles. And the remaining 2 robots are following after you. And they're going to crash very soon now. All right, so Chase, you run away from the enemies. You avoid the walls and robots. These walls are electrified fences is what they decided to call them. And then another important thing is that the robots always follow the shortest passable route to chase you. You can predict exactly where they're going to go. And if you're lined up with them like you happen to be right now, then they will just come closer to you. But if they were diagonal in any way, they would take a diagonal route to get to you. And all you do is you avoid getting killed and you want to get the robots to run into the obstacles. And that's it. All right, and so to understand how this was created, what sort of things were going on at the time, you also need a little short basic idea of where BASIC came from. BASIC was created at Dartmouth College by members of the math department, John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz. Kemeny later became the president of Dartmouth College. BASIC stands for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, and the whole idea was to be a lot more easy than the existing languages of the time that only people who were really into computer science and math could figure out. They were opening it up to a lot more people. And of course, they integrated into the Dartmouth time sharing system. Like it was mentioned earlier in a little promo, BASIC was created 60 years ago. First started in May of 1964, slightly after midnight, in fact. This screen here shows you kind of a setup for how the first BASIC lab was run. Kurtz is in the middle there at the mainframe from General Electric at the computer lab. Kemeny is on the right, accessing DTSS at home with his daughter, Jennifer. The other three photos there are basically computer labs, or eventually BASIC was integrated into the whole college. People in all sorts of classes were using it. They estimated up to 85% of students were using it because it was integrated so well. But if you look at this picture, you can see that the first terminals were teletype machines. And also one of them has a little phone attached to it that you can see there. That's how they communicated. So basically what you do with those teletypes is you would submit your information in and you would get a printout back. A little different than how a screen would update because everything's printed out for you each time. And all the students and professors could use it too, would share their basic programs, adapt the code, make improvements, things like that. And Kemeny was pretty forward thinking. He believed that games would help popularize the language. And of course they did, because that's what a lot of people were using it. This is in contrast to other systems at the time, where if they saw that you were using up the university resources to have a game, they would just delete it. We lost a lot of really good games that way. Chase was created on this system, we believe, pretty sure, but we don't have a copy of the original, so we don't have exact proof. So we don't have the original, but we have, first of all, the first indication that we can still find that Chase existed was in Creative Computing magazine in the first issue of 1976. So you can see from the cover there, robots are playing cards with nuts and bolts as chips. And you can see listed on the cover that Chase is one of the games. This version of Chase was done by Bill Cotter. And David All, also forward thinking, he was the editor of Creative Computing. He tried to credit the original authors too, but here it's listed as unknown, so that's no help. This was created on the Honeywell hardware by General Electric, which was the same hardware that DTSS used, which means this must be really close to the original code. And in this version, the only choices you had were moving in one of the 8 directions surrounding you. You couldn't teleport, which is a major feature later. You couldn't even wait in place and have the robots chase after you where you are. You had to move, which is a little strange. The next version of Chase, Herman de Monstoy, Kilobaud Magazine, 1977. This was basically the same. The only change was that you could decide not to print out a map, save paper. Because it's so predictable, you could kind of guess where the robots were going each round. So you wouldn't necessarily have to print it out. Now, as a comparison, Chase was also ported to assembly language. Assembly a little bit different than BASIC. BASIC was easier. The code for that ran about half a page. The assembly language code ran about 6 pages. It was really hard to figure out. I don't like assembly. The major change they added here was they added the first teleport already, which was hitting the P button for panic. This screenshot is from a Sol 20, which was very early computer. the little jellyfish symbols there are the robots. In some other games, it was like the ghosts in their version of Pac-Man or a lunar lander, etc. But that's in Dr. Dobbs' journal in 1977. Then we have another version of Chase, 1978. Graphics were very basic there. It also includes teleport because it's already popular, and added a last stand option where you could choose not to move for the entire rest of the game and hope that the robots crash into obstacles all by themselves. And then another version, Killer Bot by Roger Olson in 1979. The premise here was you were moving room to room, and you would eventually get to a room so you could you could deactivate a nuclear bomb. Anyway, next up is kind of the major iteration of Chase. It has all the features that we later know as basically things you could do in Chase. It added the teleport option. It added the stay in place. It added the last stand. Basically, it's the Chase we know and love. This was again in creative computing. This was in 1975. The new note they added was, I believe this game was originally created by Mac Oglesby, which is the next slide. It's then modified by Bill Cotter, which we've seen, and further improved by Arnold Loveridge. We don't really know who Arnold Loveridge was or did. Maybe he did that version of Chase on the previous slide. Everything else is still the same. So that leads us into a very interesting question here. Did Oglesby write Chase? Well, Mac Oglesby wrote a lot of basic games on DTSS, starting in 1974 when they loaned him a teletype machine and a phone to connect to the network. He was so grateful, he decided to really help him out, so he made a bunch of games. All became convinced that Oglesby created Chase, and in a few years, he directly called it Oglesby's game. Case closed, right? Well, problem is, Oglesby denied creating the game. Said he didn't create it, he didn't even port it, he just saw it on a Commodore PET at some point. And this is all according to Maury Markowitz. So that's pretty big there. If it was his, he probably would have said he did it. More on this later. Then we have a new version. It's called Escape for the first time. It's by J. Victor Nahijian and William S. Hodge in the book Computer Games, which came out in 1979, reprinted in 1980 and 81. This is probably the first version of Chase that didn't have a robot theme. It was based on military combat, as you can see from their illustration here. It was a lot like Chase, though. They changed it so you could only teleport twice. I don't know why. One really new thing is they changed it so that when the attackers collided, they both randomly teleport, which I can only imagine was really a pain. You just spent your time trying to get away from them, and they just suddenly jump on you or something. And then, and this is also important, when you teleport, probably should have mentioned it earlier, teleport goes anywhere. You could instantly land on one of the obstacles or a robot and die. Wasn't safe. It's just a last ditch move. And then Escape also added a tank, which destroyed everything it touched. All right. Next up, High Volts is an interesting one because kind of like Chase, we don't have a copy of the original version. It was created by Douglas Jones on Plato. And I'm guessing 1979, could be as early as 1974, but I think later makes more sense. The mock-up of the screen here is based upon how Jones describes it. And then the logo, though, is the one that Jones made. Peculiarity here, the enemies are called MOs. That's ohm backwards. It's kind of an electrical joke, I guess. And this was not a new idea he came up with. He saw some other game and he created it based on his memory of that game. So it was a little different, but basically it originally came from Chase because it's similar otherwise. Really like the orange and black. Going with the Volt theme, next up is H-Volt by Greg Rappa. Creative computing again, this time in 1979. Lots of people updating these things all the time. We've got a bunch of versions I never even mentioned. This one, though, it's really weird because it's like Chase, but it's also like chess. And I haven't fully figured it out myself, but the idea was that the interceptor robots moved the exact same way you moved. So if you moved up, they moved up, which means they could never actually kill you. What did kill you was other attackers, and they moved like chess pieces, I guess. I don't know. You can see a little bit of the basic code here. It's got print commands in the middle for printing something to the screen. It's got arrays at the bottom, so forth. Still never figured this one out. Then we've got Escape with an exclamation mark. This was created by Sublogic in 1981 for the Apple II. Big change here was it was graphics instead of text and played real time and not on a grid. You can see from the graphic there that some of those things aren't lining up exactly. It's more arcadey that way. The player also has a gun, I think for the first time. You can zap, but only 8 times, and you could teleport, which is very popular these days. All right, and then this one, I bet it looks out of place here. This is totally different, but there's a bunch of games that I haven't included because they weren't enough like Chase. I've included this one because it was actually directly inspired by Chase, and the developers admitted it. So Eugene Jarvis and Larry DeMar for Williams Electronics created this arcade game in 1982, Robotron 2084. The first version of it they made only had the enemies that were grunts and electrodes. Grunts, of course, being what we think of as Chase robots, and electrodes as being electrified fences. That was it. When they showed it to other people, they really liked it, but what could we add? Well, they added a lot. They added the option to rescue humans. They added a whole bunch of new enemies. And one of the coolest things was they had twin stick shooting. So you could just fire off a million, it seemed like, zaps all around the board and just kill everything. It was a lot of fun. All right, Stalking Dead. Next up, Zombies and Potholes by Julian Tippett, 1983 for the Jupiter Ace. This was not the first version of Chase where they had zombies. It's just the first time I bothered to put it on screen. I think the earlier versions were created by Tippett or someone in these computer areas that just kind of saw it and adapted it. I don't know. And you can kind of see it there. One interesting thing about this is a review complained that you needed 8 keys to play, and people only had 5 fingers. And oh my gosh, how does that work? I just don't understand. Yeah, weird. Okay, next one is a really important one. Mainly, and this is kind of funny, this is the one that I learned how to play on. Yep. That's why I consider it important. It's Hobbit by David Sweet for the TRS-80 color computer. It's Rainbow Magazine in 1983. This was their adventure issue, so we made a little adventure game. The player, I guess, is supposed to be an invisible hobbit because you only see the 2 eyes. The obstacles are kind of like trees, although they sort of look more like mushrooms. And the enemies are orcs, which are those white things, which, I don't know, also kind of look like mushrooms. I don't know, kind of low-res graphics. This one didn't have teleportation. It was more like the original Chase. But once a game, you could hit new and get a new screen if you didn't like the one you were given. One peculiarity here is there were 3 rounds. You got points based upon how many orcs you chose to play against. But if you killed them all, you got bonus points. And if you died, you got negative points for the round. And they added it all up at the end. So you wanted to face as many orcs as you think you could defeat. Which brings us into another point here, going back to who created Chase. While researching this guy, I discovered that David Sweet, or at least someone by the same name, made a basic game back in Dartmouth College. It was about bullfighting. And it was done sometime before 1974 because it was printed in a book in January of 1974. Is this the same David Sweet? I don't know, but another interesting point is both games gave you more points if you took more dangerous actions. So it's very possible that he played Chase while he was at Dartmouth College and decided, hey, they've got an adventure issue coming out. I'll just adapt it and make my own. But it's also possible he's the one who made the original version of Chase. We don't know that, though. We don't even know if it was the same guy. But maybe. A couple more quick. Robot Minefield, 1983, in the Giant Book of Computer Games by Tim Hartnell and Nathan Butcher. A couple changes on this one. The player couldn't move diagonally for some weird reason, but the robot still could, which wasn't fair at all, I think. But when the robots collided, they didn't die, they merged, which also seems weird. And then the next one is Klopjacht by E.A. Vandermost on the Philips P2000, computer popular in the Netherlands, where this is from, 1984. I just like saying Klopjacht, which is Dutch for manhunt. Moving on to a really important version, Robots. Really generic name, but very influential, by Alan Black for Unix in 1984. A lot of people think this was the very first version of the game because it's the first one they heard of, which I guess how that goes. But it's very, very, very similar to the original Chase, or at least the 1979 version. The only major difference is it doesn't come pre-stocked with obstacles. There are no electrical fences. You don't get an obstacle until 2 or more of the robots crash and make a junk heap. But otherwise, it plays exactly the same. And then this became so well known, it really became most people's idea of the game. Also that same year, Daleks came out by Johan Strandberg for the Apple Mac, 1984. Also had no obstacles to start until they crashed and made junk heaps. Bit of a new thing was the Sonic Screwdriver. Sonic Screwdriver and Daleks were both part of the Doctor Who TV show. The Sonic Screwdriver destroyed any robot that happened to be 1 space away from you. So anything in those 8 spaces got destroyed. You could use it once around. Because Robots doesn't have anything like that, I think Daleks was based on Robots. And then after that, almost everything is an adaptation of Robots or Daleks, with very little variation. I mean, it was a pretty good version of it, so that's not so bad. But a lot of these are even called just Robots or Daleks. There are other names. One slightly new one, Trolls by Bob Nystrom, who I believe talked at one of these conferences, and Mark Sanicola, Apple Mac, 1999. You would choose your character before you started, and they each got special moves. Warrior slashed a sword. The wizard could teleport, but the others couldn't. And the elf could fire arrows. It also introduced blocks, which prevented the enemies, the trolls, from moving. Okay, so why would you create a version of Chase these days? Well, till you play it, it's kind of hard to tell, but it is very, very addictive. Something about the logic, the basicness of it, it just really works. It's really fun to play. It's also easy to make non-violent if that's something you want to do. Zombies in potholes, for example, didn't kill the zombies; they just dropped out of sight. Could be something else. It's also a good entry level programming project. A lot of people, when they start programming a roguelike, kind of pull out their hair because there's so much to do. Not really a problem with Chase, at least it doesn't have to be. And then anything you learn how to do while you're making Chase could also be applied to a roguelike later. So that's cool. And then, of course, you could make all sorts of genres. You could make changes and adapt it. Perfect example of that, Seven Seas by PopCap in 2001. They created a pirate theme, 3 different types of ships, each worked differently, whirlpools, treasure hunt, sea monster, all sorts of fun. Ways you could adapt Chase mindset into a roguelike. Well, it adds variety to your games, a little bit different than the normal way of handling a roguelike. The monsters could be all sorts of different things instead of just robots. Now, I kind of at the top have the 3 main ones here, the robot, the zombie, and the orc. But I also have a bunch of other ideas there. These enemies wouldn't have to be instantly fatal because that's not really a roguelike thing. Could do lots of damage or infect with some sort of status effect, something like that. The electrified fences could be adapted to be magic fields, traps, pools of lava, pits. Basically, you want to use it to do whatever inspires your creativity. And that's actually it for my presentation. I don't know how I'm doing on time.
Excellent.
Questions, things like that?
Yeah, if people have questions, we have a couple minutes. We could probably do one question,
Okay.
but
Let me put the headset on so I can hear it a little better.
sure thing. But yeah, thank you. That's a fun
Thanks.
time. I was thinking that yeah, well, and I started with a basic variant, and Breakout was always the game I would make because Breakout is like simple, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and I just think it's really interesting too the way that programs used to be shared through magazines and that you'd get it and have to type it all in, and
Yeah.
the tracing the lineages like that.
Yeah. And it was nice when they were like half a page because you had less chance of screwing up. Hobbits, which I played, was 2 pages mostly for the graphics, and man, you would have so many typos. And
Yeah, and I think, and it's interesting the way that is still alive now. Like Sam points out, now it's YouTube tutorials, and I was mentioning 7-Day Roguelike as the way that people jam on concepts. But
oh,
I think it seems like we could do a Chase-inspired game jam, and that would be a fun time.
yeah, definitely. You'd be
Oh,
surprised how fun it is.
yeah, we do have a couple questions, so we can at least hit one. Cliff asks how you did your research. Like, how do you track down the kind of books and magazines for reference here?
Oh, sure. I had, 3 basic resources. I looked at Wikipedia to get a general idea. A lot of that, their timeline's a little screwy, which is why Internet Archive became really important because you could see all the originals. Some of these I talked about here, I had no idea existed. Zombies and Potholes was brand new to me. And then I also cross-checked it with Moby Games because they have a category for chase-like games, and it was a way to try to find things.
Cool. One other question from DM that I think is interesting. Which Chase variant do you think is the most maximalist? Like the most features, the most complexity, just like tossed everything in?
Well, I didn't include some things that were so far afield that it doesn't feel like Chase anymore. I think some things have a little bit of Chase in it. But for the pure Chase-like experience, I think the most recent one, Seven Seas, has a lot of variety. And honestly, adding a bunch of stuff to it somehow dilutes the purity of it, which is part of why it's so addictive. I really liked Daleks a lot. I spent way too many days playing that. I didn't play Hobbit that much, honestly. It just was a little too random for me, which kind of sucked after typing that in. But
Excellent. No, it makes sense that there is something to say. I mean, I read a book on a bunch of physical games like chess and Go and checkers, and there was a point about, we have games that survive for longer. Obviously, chess older than chase, but there's something to be said that there's just certain games that hit on something simple and compelling and understandable that just persists, and it makes sense that maybe it's one of those things where if you add too much to it, you've lost that kind of
yeah,
minimalist core that is what has let it be carried over to so many versions.
right. And that's also why I think Robotron is so great, because they added so much stuff. It doesn't even seem like Chase anymore, but it is. It is Chase.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for holding out to the end of the Saturday and for sharing the lineage of this game with us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.